The seat was not stolen with force, but with a champagne glass, a smile, and a husband who chose not to move. At the Astor Grand in Manhattan, the ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers, all gold light, white roses, black tuxedos, and soft strings rising above the quiet murmur of donors who paid $10,000 a plate to feel generous in public. Caroline Bennett paused at the entrance with her navy gown brushing the marble floor, her silver clutch held lightly in both hands, and for one breath, she let the room come back to her. St. Helena Children's Hospital had held its annual gala here for years. She knew the scent of lilies near the auction tables, the velvet rope beside the donor wall, the program cards printed on thick ivory paper. She knew which corner her mother had once stood in while refusing to let photographers take her picture. But that night, the room felt wrong before Caroline understood why. Then she saw the front table. At the center, beside the small brass plaque reading Founder's Donor Seat, Vivian Cole sat where Caroline's name card had been placed. Vivian wore a pale gold gown, and a smile shaped carefully enough to look innocent from across the room. Caroline's name card had not vanished. It had been pushed aside, half covered beneath Vivian's champagne flute, the black ink of Caroline Bennett still visible under the wet ring of glass. Behind Vivian's chair stood Harrison Bennett, Caroline's husband, one hand resting on the back of the seat as if he were presenting her to the room. He looked polished in his tuxedo, handsome in the distant way successful men become when they have learned to make betrayal appear like confidence. Vivian noticed Caroline first. She tilted her head and smiled as though Caroline had arrived late to her own life. "Oh," she said, just loud enough for the nearest donors to hear. "I thought donor seats were for the women standing beside the donors." A small silence opened around the table. Someone lowered a wine glass. A board member looked toward Harrison, waiting for him to correct her, to laugh it off, to lift the name card and return dignity to the place where it had been printed. Harrison did none of those things. He only adjusted his cuff and stepped closer to Caroline, lowering his voice without softening it. "Let us not make this uncomfortable. There is an open seat near the back." Caroline looked at him, then at Vivian's clutch placed neatly over the edge of the brass plaque, as if decoration could hide meaning. The words near the plaque blurred for a second, not because Caroline could not read them, but because she could. Founder's Donor Seat. The chair had never been about status. It had been reserved for the person whose gift carried the largest burden quietly, the person whose name was tied to the children's recovery wing still under construction 3 miles uptown. Caroline felt the sting rise behind her eyes, but she did not reach for the chair. She did not move Vivian's glass. She did not ask Harrison what kind of man lets another woman sit on his wife's name. Instead, she touched the gala program folded under her arm, where her mother's name appeared in small print, and gave a calm nod that made Harrison look away first. Across the ballroom, Eleanor Hayes, the gala host and foundation board chair, had seen everything. Long before Vivian Cole covered Caroline Bennett's name card with a champagne flute, the Founder's Donor Seat had belonged to a promise made in a hospital hallway that smelled of antiseptic, vending machine coffee, and rain-soaked coats. Caroline had been 13 the first time her mother, Margaret Bennett, brought her to St. Helena Children's Hospital instead of a holiday luncheon at a private club. It was December in New York, cold enough for the sidewalks to shine with ice, and Caroline remembered being confused as they walked past the lobby Christmas tree, past a nurse carrying tiny blankets, past a father asleep upright in a plastic chair with a paper cup balanced in his hand. Margaret wore a gray wool coat and no jewelry except her wedding ring, though by then everyone knew the marriage had begun to come apart behind closed doors. She did not look broken. She looked focused. She led Caroline to the pediatric recovery floor, where families waited for news with the kind of patience that seemed too heavy for their bodies. One mother sat near the window counting dollar bills from a worn envelope, smoothing each one as if careful hands could make the amount grow. Margaret saw it, and Caroline saw her mother see it. That was the lesson. Not a speech, not a photograph, just a woman with means noticing another woman without enough, then choosing not to look away. Later, in the elevator, Caroline asked why they had come. Margaret looked at the glowing floor numbers and said, "Because charity is not about being seen, sweetheart. It is about making sure someone else is not forgotten." Years later, after Margaret passed, Caroline found that sentence written in blue ink at the top of a file labeled St. Helena. Inside were receipts, letters, small grant agreements, notes from doctors, and one photograph of Margaret sitting beside a little girl in a yellow sweater who had drawn a crooked heart on hospital stationery. Caroline cried over that file in the quiet study of her mother's townhouse, not because the money surprised her, but because the silence did. Margaret had given for years without naming a wing, without buying applause, without standing at a podium while people clapped for mercy. Caroline continued the work because it was the only way grief felt useful. She created the Margaret Bennett Children's Fund, signed the first major transfer on a rainy Tuesday morning, and told the foundation office not to put her name in the press materials. The donations paid for recovery rooms, family lodging, meal vouchers, therapy spaces, and emergency treatment support for children whose parents were already carrying too much fear to carry a bill alone. Harrison knew some of it. At first, he admired it in the way men admire generosity when it does not interfere with their own reflection. He attended 2 hospital tours beside her, shook hands with physicians, and called Margaret remarkable on the drive home. But as his own public life grew brighter, he began to treat Caroline's quiet giving like a background detail, something respectable but not useful unless attached to his image. He liked galas, donor walls, reserved tables, rooms where names were announced and cameras flashed. Caroline liked the hallway after the applause, where nurses folded donated blankets and parents finally slept. Now, in the Astor Grand Ballroom, she stood before the front table while Vivian sat in the chair built from her mother's promise. The brass plaque caught the chandelier light. The name card was still half hidden beneath glass. Caroline thought of the mother counting dollar bills by the hospital window, of Margaret's gray coat, of the little girl's crooked heart, and understood that Vivian had not taken a seat. She had touched a sacred memory with careless hands. Harrison noticed Caroline looking at the brass plaque and stepped closer, placing himself between her and the donor table with the smooth efficiency of a man rearranging a room before anyone called it cruel. His tuxedo jacket caught the chandelier light, perfect at the shoulders, black silk lapels sharp against his white shirt, but the polish only made the moment colder. "Caroline," he said, low enough to pretend kindness and loud enough for Vivian to hear. "Not here." She looked past him to the chair, to the half-hidden name card, to Vivian's champagne flute resting over her printed name like a small glass weight. The wet ring had begun to spread into the ivory cardstock. A tiny thing, almost nothing. Yet Caroline felt it like a hand pressed over her mouth. Vivian crossed one ankle over the other beneath the table and adjusted the pale gold fabric of her gown with careful elegance. "There really is a lovely table near the back," she said. "I saw it when we came in. Much quieter." Around them, the front table held its breath. A hospital trustee in a black dress stared down at her program. A surgeon from St. Helena shifted his chair back an inch, then stopped. One of Harrison's business friends lifted his wine glass, decided against drinking, and set it down again without making a sound. Everyone understood what was happening. No one wanted to be the first person to name it. Caroline's fingers tightened around her silver clutch, then relaxed. She had learned long ago that the first victory over humiliation was refusing to perform the pain on someone else's schedule. Harrison leaned in, his cologne familiar enough to ache. "This evening matters," he said. "There are board members here, donors, press. We do not need an awkward scene." There it was, the same sentence wearing a tuxedo. "We," as if they were still a unit when he needed cover. Awkward, as if the discomfort belonged to the woman being displaced, not to the people who had moved her. Scene, as if dignity became disorder the moment she asked for it back. Caroline turned her eyes to him. "That is my seat." Harrison's jaw tightened, almost invisibly. "It is a seat at a charity dinner." Vivian gave a soft laugh, light enough to dissolve if challenged. "Exactly. The children are what matters, right?" The words were safe on the surface, almost noble, and Caroline hated how easily cruelty could borrow the language of kindness. She looked at the stage, where a podium stood beneath a wash of warm light. Behind it, a large screen showed smiling children in hospital gowns, nurses holding balloons, families wrapped in relief. Margaret Bennett's name appeared near the bottom of the gala program in a small foundation history note, so modestly printed that anyone could miss it unless love had trained them to look. Caroline had not come for applause. She had come because St. Helena mattered, because her mother had loved quiet service, because the new pediatric recovery wing was scheduled to open in 6 weeks, and she wanted to see the final funding secured before winter. She had not expected to be honored, but she had also not expected to watch her mother's legacy used as a chair for another woman's performance. Harrison glanced toward the back of the room and motioned slightly to a young event assistant, who approached with the nervous smile of someone already apologizing inside. "Mrs. Bennett," the assistant said softly, "we have a seat prepared for you at table 16. Caroline saw the shame in the young woman's eyes and chose not to place more weight on her. "Thank you," she said. Vivian's smile sharpened by one careful degree. She picked up her clutch and set it fully over Caroline's name card, hiding the letters at last. "Enjoy the evening," she said. Harrison looked relieved too soon. Caroline gave no answer. She stepped away from the front table, moving through the soft gold light while the orchestra continued playing as if nothing sacred had been touched. At table 16, near the rear of the ballroom beside a service aisle and a folded stand of extra programs, Caroline sat down alone. She placed her gala program on the table, smoothed the page where her mother's name appeared, and blinked once before the tears could fall. Across the ballroom, Eleanor Hayes closed her own program slowly, watching the front table with an expression that had stopped being polite. At table 16, the room looked different. From the front, the Astor Grand Ballroom had seemed like a painting of generosity. Chandeliers, roses, champagne, silk gowns, polished shoes, and the warm glow of people wanting to be seen giving. From the back, Caroline could see the machinery behind it. Waiters moved through narrow spaces with trays held carefully over their shoulders. Event assistants checked folded seating charts with anxious fingers. A volunteer from St. Helena Children's Hospital knelt near a cardboard box of auction paddles, counting again because the evening depended on details no one would applaud. Caroline watched all of it and felt the strange relief of being closer to the work than to the performance. Her table was near the service aisle, half hidden behind a column wrapped in white flowers. A folded stand of extra programs leaned against the wall beside her chair. The orchestra softened into a slower piece, and across the ballroom Vivian laughed at something Harrison said, her gold gown bright beneath the chandelier, Caroline's chair still beneath her. Caroline lowered her eyes to the program in front of her. Margaret Bennett Children's Fund appeared in small print near the foundation history, placed between a paragraph about legacy giving and a list of renovation partners. No photograph, no bold announcement, no quote. Exactly as Caroline had requested. After her marriage began breaking apart, she had stopped using her pain as a room to sit in and began turning it into something with windows. The first transfer went to neonatal intensive care monitors after a doctor explained that one outdated machine had been moved between rooms too often. The second paid for temporary apartments within walking distance of the hospital, so parents from upstate New York would not sleep in cars or waiting chairs while their children recovered. Then came meal vouchers, winter coats for siblings, therapy rooms painted in soft colors, transportation funds, emergency treatment support for families whose insurance stopped where fear began, and a quiet endowment for nurses who had been paying for small patient needs out of their own pockets. Caroline signed each approval from her mother's old desk, beneath a black and white photograph of Margaret standing outside St. Helena in a gray coat, holding the hand of a little girl Caroline had never met. Harrison had rarely asked about the details. When he did, it was with the restless impatience of a man who wanted generosity to become a headline or a connection. He once suggested that the Bennett name appear more prominently on the donor wall. Caroline had answered that her mother did not give to become marble. He had smiled then, not because he agreed, but because disagreeing would have made him sound smaller than he wanted to be. Eventually, he stopped asking. That silence gave Caroline room. She learned the names of departments, not just donors. She sat with nurses after midnight tours. She walked unfinished hallways and flats while construction dust settled on her coat. She met parents who thanked the hospital without knowing who had paid for the room where they finally slept. Each unknown thank you reached her more deeply than applause ever could. Now Vivian sat at the front table, using a chair as proof of arrival, while the true work sat quietly in Caroline's lap, printed in letters small enough for pride to miss. Caroline touched her mother's name on the program with one finger, then looked toward the stage. Eleanor Hayes stood near the podium, speaking to an assistant with her program closed in one hand and her expression sharpened into decision. Eleanor Hayes had chaired enough galas to know when a room was pretending not to see what was directly in front of it. She had watched donors arrive with generous checks and hungry egos, watched board members argue over table placement as if proximity to the stage could measure compassion, watched wealthy men confuse attendance with sacrifice. But what happened at the front table was different. It was not vanity. It was erasure. From beside the podium, Eleanor had seen Caroline Bennett pause at the donor table, seen Vivian Cole sitting in the founder's donor seat, seen Harrison Bennett lean down and speak to his wife with the controlled impatience of a man asking the wounded person to keep the carpet clean. She had seen Vivian place her clutch over Caroline's name card as casually as someone covering a stain. Eleanor's fingers closed around the edge of her program. The paper bent once beneath her thumb. She looked toward table 16, where Caroline now sat near the service aisle with the quiet dignity of a woman who had been moved but not diminished. That seat at the front had not been assigned by mistake. Eleanor had personally approved it. It was not a social favor, not a courtesy for Harrison, not a symbol for the Bennett family name. It was the foundation's most protected seat, reserved for the person whose gift had made the new pediatric recovery wing possible. 6 months earlier, Eleanor had stood with Caroline in the unfinished hallway of St. Helena while contractors measured glass panels and nurses described where families would wait after surgery. There had been dust on the floor, plastic sheeting over the windows, and a little boy in a knit cap rolling a toy ambulance along the temporary wall while his father signed forms nearby. Caroline had watched the child play, then asked the architect whether the family rooms could be widened by 3 feet to fit sleeper chairs beside each bed. The change cost more. Caroline approved it before the architect finished explaining the number. Parents should not have to choose between staying close and sleeping sitting up, she had said. Eleanor had remembered that sentence because people who gave for recognition asked where the plaque would go. Caroline asked where tired parents would rest. Since then, the Margaret Bennett Children's Fund had carried the hospital through problems no gala speech could make elegant: equipment delays, insurance gaps, therapy staffing, transport for families from rural counties, emergency care funds for children whose parents had already sold everything easy to sell. Caroline asked for reports, not applause. She read line items. She remembered names. She corrected spelling on thank you notes to nurses. She refused photographs. Even tonight, the printed program gave her only one modest mention in the foundation history because that was what she had requested. Eleanor looked back at the front table. Vivian was laughing now, accepting introductions from Harrison as if she had earned the room by arriving beside him. A photographer hovered nearby, uncertain whether to capture the image. Eleanor lifted one hand to stop him. He lowered the camera. Her assistant, Grace, approached with a tablet and a headset tucked behind one ear. "We are 6 minutes from the auction opening," Grace whispered. "Do you need the final pledge order?" Eleanor kept her eyes on Caroline. "Change the order." Grace blinked. "For the auction?" "Before the auction." Eleanor closed the program fully. "We are correcting the seating before we honor the gift." Grace glanced toward the front table, understood more than Eleanor had said, and turned pale with professional alarm. "Do you want security?" "No," Eleanor said. "I want the donor record, the wing announcement file," and the spotlight moved to table 16. Across the ballroom, Caroline sat with her hands folded over her mother's name, unaware that the room which had pushed her backward was about to be asked to turn around. For the next 15 minutes, the ballroom behaved as if nothing had happened, which made the humiliation sharper. The orchestra lifted into a brighter arrangement. Waiters moved between tables with salads arranged like small gardens, and donors leaned toward one another under the chandeliers, speaking in voices polished by wealth and habit. At the front table, Harrison guided Vivian through introductions with the ease of a man presenting an investment he expected the room to approve. "Vivian Cole," he said to a hospital trustee. "She has been very involved in my recent foundation work." It was not exactly a lie, because vague sentences rarely had the courage to be lies. Vivian smiled, offered her hand, and let the pale gold fabric of her gown catch every camera flash that drifted near the donor table. She had learned quickly where to place her shoulder, when to tilt her chin, how to laugh without showing too much surprise at being welcomed into rooms she had not built. Every few minutes, her eyes moved toward table 16. Not long enough to look cruel, just long enough to make sure Caroline saw. Caroline did see. She saw Vivian receive compliments beside the founder's donor seat. She saw Harrison bend toward her with the attention he once reserved for his wife in public. She saw her own name still hidden beneath a clutch and a glass at the front of the room, and something inside her settled into a colder kind of clarity. Pain, when it first arrives, begs to be answered. But after a while, if a woman survives it quietly enough, it becomes information. Caroline folded her napkin across her lap and listened to a nurse at the neighboring table describe the recovery wing with gentle excitement. Unaware that the woman beside her had funded the sleeper chairs, the family showers, the therapy rooms, and the small kitchen where parents would be able to warm soup at 2 in the morning. It will change everything for families, the nurse said to another guest. Not just the patients. The parents, too. Caroline looked down at her water glass so the softness in her eyes would not become visible. That was why she had come. Not for Harrison. Not for the chair. Not for Vivian's smile or the front table's approval. She had come for the parents who would not have to sleep sitting upright. For children waking up to walls painted in sunrise colors instead of institutional beige. For her mother's sentence still alive in every quiet payment. Make sure someone else is not forgotten. Across the ballroom, Eleanor Hayes moved with calm purpose. Grace returned to her side, carrying a slim folder from the foundation records and a small tablet, glowing with the donor summary. The production manager near the stage adjusted his headset, then glanced toward table 16. A lighting technician lifted one hand discreetly from beside the curtain. The spotlight, which had been angled toward the auction display, shifted by inches. No one at the front table noticed. Harrison was busy accepting congratulations for the evening's turnout. Vivian was busy being seen. Caroline was the only person at table 16 who felt the room begin to change before it happened. The music softened. The stage lights warmed. Eleanor stepped behind the podium earlier than the program schedule indicated. A low murmur passed through the ballroom as people turned forward, expecting auction instructions, paddle numbers, perhaps a charming joke about generosity. Harrison took his seat beside Vivian, still confident enough to rest one hand near her chair. Vivian lifted her champagne flute and gave Caroline one last small smile across the room. Then Eleanor touched the microphone, closed the folder in front of her, and waited until the ballroom went completely silent. Eleanor Hayes did not begin with a joke, and that was the first sign the evening had shifted. She stood at the podium beneath the warm stage lights, silver hair swept neatly back, black evening dress simple enough to make every diamond in the room look slightly unnecessary. The microphone caught the soft sound of her breath before her voice settled over the ballroom. "Before we begin the auction," she said, "there is a correction we need to make." The donors stilled in their chairs. Correction was not a word people expected at a gala. They expected gratitude, inspiration, a gentle reminder that generosity looked beautiful when paired with champagne. At the front table, Harrison's fingers paused beside his wine glass. Vivian kept her smile in place, but Caroline saw the tiny change in her posture, the way her shoulders pulled back as if elegance could become armor. Eleanor looked down at the folder Grace had placed before her, then lifted her eyes toward the front of the ballroom. "Tonight, we are gathered to support the new pediatric recovery wing at St. Helena Children's Hospital. Many of you have given generously, and every gift matters. But before we honor the largest gift in the hospital's recent history, we must first honor the seat assigned to that gift." A faint movement passed through the room. Programs opened. Heads tilted. At table 16, Caroline felt her hand still over the page where her mother's name was printed. She did not know what Eleanor intended, not fully, but she felt the air tighten around a truth that had been waiting too long to stand up. Eleanor continued, calm and precise. The founder's donor seat at the front table was reserved tonight for the representative of the Margaret Bennett Children's Fund. The name moved through the ballroom like a match touched to silk. Margaret Bennett. Caroline heard it not as an announcement, but as memory, a gray wool coat, a hospital hallway, a woman counting dollar bills by a window, her mother's voice saying that charity meant making sure someone else was not forgotten. At the front table, Vivian's smile finally faltered. She glanced down at the brass plaque near her plate, then at the clutch covering Caroline's name card. Harrison leaned toward her, not close enough to comfort, only close enough to calculate. Eleanor did not look away from them. It appears that the seat was occupied in error. No one spoke. No one needed to. The phrase was polite, but the room understood the shape of it. Vivian had not been lost. Harrison had not been confused. Caroline had been moved. A trustee slowly turned in his chair toward table 16. Then another guest followed. Then another. The back of the room began to receive the attention the front table had tried to steal. Caroline remained seated, her navy gown dark against the white tablecloth, her eyes bright but steady. She hated being seen for pain. But this was not pain anymore. This was record. This was history returning to the correct page. Harrison stood halfway, his chair moving softly against the carpet. "Eleanor," he said, wearing a smile that had become too thin to protect him, "I am sure this is a small seating misunderstanding." Eleanor's gaze rested on him with the chilled grace of institutional authority. "No, Mr. Bennet. The seating was correct when the doors opened." The words were quiet enough for manners and sharp enough for consequence. Vivian's fingers moved toward the champagne glass, then stopped. If she lifted it, she would reveal the name card beneath. If she left it there, the glass would remain exactly what it had become, proof. Eleanor turned toward the stage manager near the curtain and gave the smallest nod. The spotlight that had been warming the auction display began to move, slowly, deliberately, away from the front table, across the roses, across the donors, across Harrison's motionless face, until it found Caroline sitting alone near the service aisle. The spotlight found Caroline before Caroline found her breath. For 1 second, the entire Astor Grand Ballroom seemed to tilt toward table 16, away from the front row of roses and champagne, away from Vivian's pale gold gown, away from Harrison's careful smile, until every chandelier reflection gathered around the woman sitting near the service aisle with her hands resting over a gala program. Caroline did not move at first. Her eyes lowered to her mother's name printed beneath her fingers, small and quiet on the ivory page, and she felt the old hospital hallway rise inside her again. Margaret's gray coat, the child in the yellow sweater, the father asleep in the plastic chair, the mother counting dollar bills by a window. Eleanor Hayes let the silence hold long enough for the room to understand that this was not a mistake being corrected. It was a truth being returned. "The largest gift in St. Helena Children's Hospital history," Eleanor said, her voice steady across the microphone, "was made through the Margaret Bennett Children's Fund, represented tonight by Mrs. Caroline Bennett." The room changed without sound at first. A fork stopped against porcelain. A program slipped from someone's lap. At the front table, Vivian's face went still, her hand frozen near the champagne glass that still covered Caroline's name card. Harrison remained half standing, no longer interrupting, no longer smiling, as if his own tuxedo had become too formal for the embarrassment inside it. Eleanor continued, each word measured with the authority of records, not opinion. "That gift has funded the final phase of our new pediatric recovery wing, including family sleeping rooms, therapy spaces, emergency treatment support, and expanded care resources for children whose families need help most." A low sound moved through the ballroom. Not quite a gasp, not quite applause, but the first breath of a room realizing it had been looking in the wrong direction. Caroline felt heat behind her eyes. She had spent years keeping her name small so the work could stay large. She had refused interviews, declined donor wall placement, corrected reports that tried to make her generosity sound glamorous. Yet now, under the spotlight, she understood that silence was not the same as disappearance. Sometimes dignity waited quietly until a room became honest enough to see it. Eleanor looked toward the large screen behind the podium. The auction display faded, replaced by a rendering of a bright hospital hallway with wide windows, soft blue walls, sleeper chairs beside patient beds, and the words "The Margaret Bennett Pediatric Recovery Wing" appearing beneath the image. This time the ballroom did react. People turned fully toward Caroline. A woman near the middle covered her mouth. The surgeon who had looked away earlier stood first, his hands coming together with quiet force. Then a trustee stood. Then a nurse. Then table after table rose, applause spreading through the ballroom until the chandeliers seemed to tremble with it. Caroline stood slowly, not because she wanted the attention, but because the gift had been made in her mother's name and Margaret deserved to be met upright. At the front table, Vivian finally lifted her champagne glass, revealing the damp name card beneath it. Caroline Bennett. The letters were blurred at one edge, but still readable. Harrison looked at the card as if seeing it for the first time. Vivian did not speak. There was nothing elegant left to say from a stolen seat. Eleanor stepped aside from the podium and extended one hand toward Caroline. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "on behalf of St. Helena, we would be honored if you would join us." Caroline glanced once at the founder's donor's seat, where Vivian sat smaller now beneath the same gold light she had tried to use as a crown. Then Caroline stepped away from table 16 and began walking toward the stage, past the donors who had finally learned which woman the evening had been built to honor. Caroline walked through the applause as if it were weather she had not asked for, warm and sudden and impossible to stop. The path from table 16 to the stage was not long, but every step seemed to pass through a different version of the evening. The service aisle where she had sat unseen, the rows of donors turning toward her with softened faces, the front table where Vivian remained in the founder's donor seat with Caroline's damp name card exposed beside her plate, and Harrison standing motionless in his tuxedo, no longer able to make the room believe he had arranged anything worth admiring. Caroline did not stop at the chair. She did not ask Vivian to rise. She did not reclaim the plaque with a gesture, or lift the champagne glass, or hold up the name card so the room could watch humiliation return to the person who had caused it. That would have made the moment smaller than her mother. Instead, she passed the chair as if it were furniture, because the legacy attached to it had already stood up and followed her. Eleanor Hayes met her at the steps with one hand extended, and when Caroline reached the podium, the ballroom quieted with the kind of respect that did not need to be requested twice. The screen behind her still showed the rendering of the Margaret Bennett Pediatric Recovery Wing. Wide windows, soft blue walls, sleeper chairs beside patient beds, a family kitchen painted in morning light. Caroline looked at it for a moment before looking at the room. Her eyes were bright, but her voice remained steady. "My mother believed a hospital should not only treat children," she said. "It should hold their families together while they are afraid." No one moved. Even the waiters near the wall stood still with trays lowered at their sides. Caroline touched the edge of the podium, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers, grounding herself in something simple. She never wanted her name to be louder than the work. So I will keep this brief. If this gift means anything, let it mean that a parent can sleep beside a child after surgery, that a family can eat without counting every dollar first, that a nurse has the resources she needs before she has to ask twice. A woman near the center table wiped her eyes. The surgeon who had stood first bowed his head. Eleanor watched Caroline with the quiet pride of someone seeing justice arrive dressed as grace. Caroline glanced once toward the front table, not at Vivian, not even at Harrison, but at the name card still lying beneath the faint ring of champagne. The ink had blurred at one corner, but the name remained. "This wing belongs to the children of St. Helena," she said, "and to every family who has ever sat in a waiting room hoping the world would be kind." The applause rose again, deeper this time, less polished and more human. Caroline stepped back from the microphone before it could become a stage for anything else. Eleanor embraced her lightly, then whispered something that made Caroline close her eyes for half a second. "Your mother would have loved that." When Caroline descended the steps, Harrison moved from the front table, as if finally remembering he had legs. Vivian stayed seated, her hands folded around the stem of a glass she no longer lifted. Caroline walked past them both. Harrison reached her near the ballroom entrance, his voice low and strained beneath the applause. "Caroline, we should talk." She paused with one hand on the folded gala program against her clutch, Margaret's name pressed beneath her palm. For a moment, she remembered the man Harrison had been when he first called her mother remarkable, before he learned to admire kindness only when it could decorate him. She turned just enough for him to see that she was not angry in the way he could argue with. She was finished in the way no argument could enter. "Talk to the people you brought here to watch me disappear," she said. Then she walked out beneath the gold archway of the Astor Grand, leaving behind chandeliers, roses, applause, a stolen chair, and a husband who finally understood that a seat could be taken for 15 minutes, but a legacy could not.